Florida was a frontier, every bit as wild and woolly as anything in the American West.
Slavery in the Spanish system gave certain rights to slaves, allowing slaves to be married and have family units, and allowing them to buy their way out of slavery as well.
Reconstruction was brought to an end by terrorism.
Florida has always used land to attract investors, but the amount of land that was given to him was just mind-boggling.
The headlines project an image of war against nature, that developers are going to bring paradise to Florida.
This program was made possible by the Florida Department of Education, the Florida Department of State, the Florida Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the following supporters.
The Florida Peninsula stretches southward to touch the tropics. Once upon a time, dense vegetation and swamps made this land almost impassable. Summers here brought inescapable heat and tropical diseases. But today, most people come to a different kind of Florida, where air conditioning tames heat, where people come and go and buildings rise from the land to the sky. This Florida had to be invented. It began on the wild frontier. When the United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1821, American settlers rushed into the new territory in droves, laden with classic American baggage, the glittering hope of a new life. Many of the newcomers went south to the prairies and piney woods wilderness in the interior of the peninsula.
Florida was a frontier. It was wild and woolly, every bit as wild and woolly as anything in the American West. Everything you've seen in the movies about the West, those cattle drives, Indian wars, cattle rustling, gunfights in the streets, violence, very much a part of life. In Kissimmee, there was even a saloon where you could ride up on your horse to get a drink.
The pioneers scratched out a living by farming, raising livestock, hunting, and trapping. Their cattle roamed the wild prairies and forests to graze.
That's right, you have to get back her king.
They are a soft-voiced, easy-going, childlike kind of folk, quick to anger, vindictive when rage is protracted and becomes a feud. But they are generous and noble in their rough hospitality. Edward King.
We found them very poor people, a man and his wife and 5 children. Their residence consisted of a log house all in one room with a fireplace and 3 beds in it. The fleas were so thick, we could not rest a minute. Catherine Hart.
They were highly individualistic. They didn't want anybody telling them what to do. They also tended to be poor, so any threat to what they had was a direct threat to them, so they hated the Indians, who were a threat.
The white farmers and herders were called crackers. The name came from the crack of their long cow whips.
Many people today see it as a very pejorative term, either somebody who's rude and uneducated and, or else a vicious racist. In our history, the term has meant a frontier settler involved with the cattle business. They love being out in the environment. Florida Cracker descendants take an awful lot of pride in qualities like that, that genuineness, that plain speaking, and that love of the land, the love of Florida.
These people can conceive of no greater happiness to a dying mortal than to take the last expiring breath, holding a cow whip in one hand and a cow's tail in the other. Anonymous Fort Meade pioneer.
Jake Summerlin's family began as classic Florida frontier people. There's no official record of Jake Summerlin's birth, and he had no formal education.
Jake could ride a horse and crack a whip when he was 7 years old, and when he was a young man, could wield a whip 18 feet long. He is proud of his early hardships and dangers. New York Tribune.
At 20, Jake fought in a war against Seminole Indians. He also wrote the governor asking for protection.
Papa, Indians!
We are afraid of a skulking party, for some of us has got danger by heart from our experience in the last war. And in our disorganized state, we are very pretty Indian bait. Jake Summerlin.
Jake worked as a deputy sheriff, ran a trading post, was a frontier postmaster, and tended cattle. He did not seem destined for enormous success, but all the while he was accumulating the surest sign of wealth in the cracker culture, cattle. With a partner, a sea captain named James McKay, he began to ship cattle to the Bahamas and Cuba. There was only one currency Jake believed in: gold.
Many have seen Jake Summerlin, the king of the crackers, in his blue shirt and rough trousers, paying out money from a peck of gold pieces heaped on a rude pine table. Fat yellow Spanish doubloons are bundled into a corn sack and left to lie in a corner. The Florida Times-Union.
There was another Florida that didn't resemble Jake Summerlin's frontier and didn't pretend to. It was a kingdom where cotton ruled and black slaves toiled. When America took over Florida in 1821, most Floridians lived in a narrow strip along the north, most of them in East Florida. Soon, American cotton planters moved down into what became known as Middle Florida. Here, planters found the same productive soil and climate as in the cotton belt of the Deep South. That climate and soil soon made them wealthy. But the planters' wealth also depended on slave labor. Slavery in Middle Florida soon mirrored the harsh system of the American South.
The slaves are generally treated with the greatest severity. A whip is the only language used with them. Arthur Seymour.
However, in East Florida, things were very different. American planters had arrived here decades earlier under Spanish rule. These planters had adopted the more tolerant Spanish attitudes about slaves.
Slavery in the Spanish system was very different than that in the English world, and it gave certain rights to slaves. And those included being able to denounce bad treatment by your master, allowing slaves to own property, allowing slaves to be married and have family units, and allowing them to buy their way out of slavery as well.
East Florida was also home to several hundred free blacks whose ancestors had earned freedom during the Spanish days.
I think that probably people are surprised to realize how much property ownership there was among the free black class, how much interaction there was with the whole community, the white community as well.
But in Middle Florida, where slavery was more harsh, planters saw free blacks as a threat to their own strict system. So they got the Territorial Council to pass laws aimed at free blacks.
It shall be unlawful for any free Negro or mulatto to migrate into the territory. Upon refusal to comply, the court shall order the immediate sale of the said free Negro.
Thanks to slave labor, tons of cotton flowed down the Apalachicola River from Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. The port city of Apalachicola on the Gulf Coast became Florida's first boomtown. Fine goods filled its shelves to meet the tastes of cotton buyers from the North and Europe. But the same warm climate that made cotton planters wealthy also encouraged something else to grow nearby. Mosquitoes, who brought fearsome epidemics of yellow fever. A local doctor, John Gorey, observed that yellow fever often struck near swamps. Like most scientists of his time, Gorey thought infectious vapors from the swamps caused these diseases. So he determined to stop yellow fever by defeating heat. John Gorey's roots were in Spain, like the first Europeans to settle Florida. In 1802, his Spanish mother brought him to the Caribbean, the crossroads between Europe and the Americas. Under Spanish rule, Florida was part of the Caribbean world for almost 350 years, its main ties to nearby Spanish islands. Adventurers and traders from the Caribbean filled Spanish Florida with many tongues and cultures. There were Portuguese fishermen, African farmers, slave and free, French merchants, and even German artillerymen. In 1803, one-year-old John Gorey and his mother sailed past the Spanish colony, bound instead for Charleston, South Carolina. John grew up like most other well-off residents of Charleston. He studied medicine, and in 1824 he apprenticed to a doctor in Columbia. Soon, a yellow fever epidemic struck, leaving a lasting impression on Dr. John Gorey.
Day after day, the long procession of wagons haul their dead to the cemetery. Signs of death are everywhere, on crepe-hung doors, lamp posts, iron gates, and carriage houses. People avoid each other for fear of contamination. The air is filled with the harsh stringency of burning tar and niter, and the sticky smell of pestilence is everywhere.
In Apalachicola, Gorey noted that the summer epidemics ended with cooler fall weather. Not knowing that mosquitoes spread the disease, Gorey thought cool temperatures were the cure. So he put patients in rooms cooled with ice. But ice had to be shipped all the way from Boston. So Gorey studied physics, chemistry, and engineering to build an ice-making machine, in effect, the world's first mechanical refrigerator. He worked for 10 years. One night in 1850, the French consul to Apalachicola invited guests to celebrate the anniversary of the French Revolution. Everyone knew the ice ship from Boston was late, but the consul bet his guests they'd have chilled champagne.
Today, it is an American, Dr. John Gorey, who works the miracle of making ice.
Gorey would never see the full result of his miracle. Ice importers, their livelihood in danger, launched a campaign against Gorey. Man-made ice, they claimed, went against nature.
There is a crank called Dr. John Gorey down in Apalachicola, Florida, who claims that he can make ice as good as God Almighty. The New York Globe.
Just 5 years later, unrecognized, he died. He'd been a dreamer. His dream was that cool air could cure the sick. But without knowing it, he created the key to conquering heat in the South. By the time John Gorey died, a new America had already been invented. It came riding in on a machine called the steam locomotive. But swampy Florida was not a candidate for a railway until David Levy became the most prominent man in the territory. Even for the stew of cultures that had been Spanish Florida, David Levy had an unusual background. His family were Jews who fled Morocco to the Caribbean to escape persecution. His father, Moses, tried to establish a utopian Jewish colony in Florida.
Moses Levy was a very, very devout man, became much more orthodox as time grew on. David, of course, rebelled against this, thought it was much too restrictive. They never did really reconcile. Father and son split off pretty much all the way till the end of their lives.
At 31, David Levy won election as the territorial delegate to Congress. He was already Florida's most popular politician. Levy advocated a controversial cause, statehood. It was no easy task.
These days, it's easy to forget that there was a great deal of resistance to statehood in Florida. Lots of people had no desire to pay federal taxes.
What's more, in his native East Florida, Levy had to overcome fears that statehood would bring domination by Middle Florida's wealthy cotton planters. Things weren't any easier for Levy in Congress.
Florida is a land of swamps or quagmires, of frogs and alligators and mosquitoes. No one would want to immigrate there, even from hell. United States Senator John Randolph.
Levy faced another obstacle in Congress.
Some members of the Congress were anti-Semitic. It's even reported that former President John Quincy Adams referred to him as that alien Jew from Florida.
But Levy's spectacular energy would not be denied.
I took up the measure, came out boldly in the face of unanimous opposition in my own district, took the stump upon the subject, have now got it through the House with a triumphant vote. David Levy.
In 1845, Florida became a state.
All the bells in the town rung their merry chimes, and the old 9-pounder bellowed forth 36 guns for the senators who voted for Florida, and 10 more for Levy, the favorite son of Florida, the Tallahassee Floridian.
David Levy was chosen as Florida's first U.S. Senator. He was the first Jew ever to serve in the Senate.
Certainly in the period before the Civil War, if there were as many as 50 Jews living in Florida, it was a lot. It's kind of surprising to find that with that few Jews, one of them would go to Congress as a territorial delegate and then as a United States Senator. So there was no anti-Semitism to speak of at the time.
More than religious background, what Floridians cared about most was development, especially carving transportation routes through the wilderness. In this, David Levy was their champion.
He was popular because he supported the kinds of things that people were interested in. He was a progressive in terms of developing the transportation facilities of Florida. So the people who needed those things liked him.
The same year he went to the Senate, David Levy married the daughter of Kentucky's former governor. Then he changed his name to David Levy Yulee.
The changing of the name from David Levy to David Levy Yulee, adding the old family name that his grandfather had dropped, was another mark of the split, I believe, between Moses and David Levy Yulee himself. Moses Levy was opposed to slavery. He actually published things anonymously that were in favor of abolition of slavery. David Levy Yulee was a strong believer in slavery. To have a father on the other end of the spectrum would have undermined a lot of his political support in Florida and throughout the United States.
A lot of people wonder if he was trying to be less Jewish, but he didn't drop the Levy name, so I don't think that is the answer to it at all. There is nothing in the historical record to show why David decided to add that Yulee to his name.
David Levy Yulee was more than an adroit politician. He was also a businessman. He knew that on admission to the Union, Florida would receive 500,000 acres of federal land. The state could use those public lands to help finance his dream, a railroad across Florida linking the Atlantic with the Gulf of Mexico.
As I love my fellow men, I spend time in doing what will be useful to them and will make them happy. One of the things that will do them good and make them happy is to make a railroad. And so as nobody else was attending to making this railroad for them, and I could do it, it was my duty to do it. David Levy Yulee.
Yulee's financing came mostly from northern banks. The state of Florida put up public land to guarantee bank loans for development plans like Yulee's.
Most of the money for developing the schemes for the canals and railroads in Florida came from the north. We just didn't have enough people, nor enough money, nor technical expertise to do the things we had to do to develop this area.
Ultimately, Jacksonville is going to come to be called the Yankee capital of Florida because that area attracted so many northerners, settlers and investors who wanted to introduce northern ways into the new American Florida.
While Northerners might bring needed expertise and money, their influence sometimes spurred jealousy and resentment. In 1856, David Yulee began laying track. He was on the verge of becoming a very wealthy man, but history had a different plan. Across the nation, two diametrically opposed forces were on a collision course.
And through the 1850s, there is growing tension that explodes over and over again. It explodes when slaveholders actually come into the North to try to recover fugitives under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Law. And in places like Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Christiana, Pennsylvania, where a slaveholder is killed in the process of trying to recover his property.
White Floridians, whether they owned slaves or not, tended to be scared to death of the whole idea of abolitionism and abolitionists. They saw it as a threat to their whole way of life.
In Florida, people who called themselves regulators came in the night to drag blacks and abolitionists from their beds. The regulators took them into the woods and whipped them.
By the middle of the 1850s, free blacks in northern cities have formed military units. Now, of course, they didn't know the Civil War was going to break out in 1861, but the point is that they knew something was going to happen, and they wanted to be ready to strike a blow against the institution of slavery.
Fear and hatred had spread all the way to the sleepy Gulf Coast town of Tampa by the time Ocean Hart, a young lawyer, moved there in 1857. Hart's father had founded Jacksonville, and the family owned slaves. But the Harts came from the more lenient East Florida tradition. Ocean supported the institution of slavery and believed that he was acting in his slaves' best interest.
Oh, no, I couldn't.
By the standards of the day, perhaps he was. In 1859, Hart defended a slave in court. A white man had been killed, and a slave named Adam was arrested for the crime. The evidence against him was pretty sparse, and Ocean Hart defended him with eloquence and energy. Not surprisingly, Adam was convicted anyway. A mob dragged Adam from jail and lynched him.
The lynching of Adam affected Ocean Hart profoundly. He was forced to call into question all his beliefs about the rule of law and about slavery.
If Ocean Hart was a mix of opinions, he was a fair reflection of his state. David Levy Yulee's dream had finally come true. His first train chugged into Cedar Key one March day in 1861. The timing was lamentable. A special convention of Floridians had just voted to secede from the Union, and David Levy Yulee, the architect of statehood, supported secession.
David Levy Yulee supported slavery because he was a slave owner. He owned a large plantation at Homosassa, and he needed labor to operate that sugar plantation.
However, he also had that railroad, which heavily depended upon northern financing. And so consequently, he had a kind of an economic conflict with secession. However, he had to, as the elected representative and as a slaveholder, he had to speak out in favor of secession.
I shall give the enemy a shot next week. I say enemy, yes. I am theirs, and they are mine. I am willing to be their masters, but not their brothers. David Levy Yulee.
The people in the South, including David Levy Yulee and other Floridians at the time, felt the same way, that they had been placed into a position of submission to the North, that the North controlled the operations of the country, and that they passed laws which were unfavorable to the goodwill and economic benefits of the South.
Particularly among the common people in Florida, there was also a sense that we're just not going to let the federal government, them damn Yankees, tell us what to do.
Pro-secession crowds danced in the streets in torchlight parades beneath fireworks.
We tend to look back now and think that secession was a very popular move in Florida, but that wasn't the case at all. And the fact was, even when the delegates voted to secede, they were afraid to put the matter to a public vote. it might well not have passed.
A significant minority of Floridians were outright Unionists, including Ocean Hart, now a Tampa City councilman.
Hart remained true to his principles and firm in his attachment to the Union, and proclaimed from the stump his devotion to the Union, in defiance of the secessionists all around him, the Florida Times-Union.
At the time of the convention that approved secession, even a former governor let fly with a forbidding warning.
You have opened the gates of hell, from which shall flow the curses of the damned, which shall sink you to perdition. Richard Keith Call.
For Florida Confederates, the enemy was close at hand even before the fighting began.
Northerners had been moving to Florida for decades, so it wasn't surprising that there were thousands of Union sympathizers. During the war, 1,300 white Floridians actually formed Union artillery and cavalry units and fought for the North on Florida soil.
But in the end, it was a handful of Florida crackers, armed with little more than whips, who frustrated the Confederacy in Florida. When the Civil War began, Jake Summerlin owned some 20,000 head, the largest herd in all of Florida. Jake had good Confederate credentials, having served as a sergeant in their army and supplied cattle to the Southern forces. A Union officer even described him as
the notorious Jake Summerlin, the great cow driver, the one who has done more for the Confederates and more injury to us than any other, Henry Crane.
But the Civil War threatened Jake's herds, everything he'd laboriously built up with his partner James McKay. The South counted on Texas cattle to help feed its armies, but when the North took Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, it could patrol the lower Mississippi River and cut off that beef supply. Now the South desperately needed Florida cattle.
So who do we put in charge of supplying the cattle to the Confederacy? A Union agent.
His name was James McKay, Jake Summerlin's old partner. Cattlemen like McKay and Summerlin rarely used slave labor. McKay himself once summed up their attitude about secession.
The cattlemen never could see any benefit they could derive by breaking up the government, but to the contrary. James McKay.
Early in the war, McKay agreed to supply the Union with horses. He was tried by the South for treason but got off. Then Union forces captured him, so he now promised to become a double agent working for the North. As the war dragged on, McKay and Summerlin no longer wanted to sell their cattle to the Confederacy for its nearly worthless paper money.
Instead, the cattle are hidden over in the Kissimmee River Valley, and the cattlemen play a waiting game, just waiting for the war to end. What they wanted to do was protect their herds till the war was over, when they could sell that beef in Cuba for gold.
But the cowmen were also divided. A few supported the South. They joined a special cow cavalry to protect the Confederate cattle shipments. But Union sympathizers joined too, because it earned them a deferment from combat. Cattle continued disappearing into the wilderness, and Confederate soldiers went hungry. In 1864, when Union forces threatened the cattle route, the South made a desperate stand at the Battle of Olustee, the biggest Civil War battle in the state. Fighting on the Union side were hundreds of black men, many of them escaped Florida slaves.
But one thing they understood, that if they got caught, more than likely they would be killed. And in fact, many of them who were injured and remained on the battlefield were later killed by the Confederates.
Private Thomas Long served in the Union Army.
If we hadn't become soldiers, then things might have gone back as they were before. Our freedom may have passed through 2 houses of Congress, and President Lincoln's 4 years might have passed us by, and nothing been done for us. But now things can never go back, because we done showed our energy, our natural courage, our natural manhood.
Though lusty, the outnumbered Confederates defeated the North. But by the war's end, Florida's Confederates had lost 5,000 dead and thousands more wounded. For the state with the smallest population, these were the highest losses per capita anywhere. Everyone in Florida knew someone who came back disabled or not at all. Even for Florida's Unionists, the war shattered spirits. In 1865, Ocean Hart's wife wrote,
"Sometimes I am led to think God has forsaken us and intends to let us destroy each other." Catherine Hart.
When the end came, the governor, John Milton, could not bear defeat. Death would be preferable to reunion, he wrote. Milton traveled home, and there he killed himself with a shotgun. Union troops had burned David Levy Yulee's home and destroyed his plantation. Florida's most distinguished politician was charged with treason and slapped into prison.
My detention has been very protracted and very injurious, but I presume that I must accept it as the particular use appointed for me in the great drama of human life. David Levy Yulee.
After 10 months, he was released, but David Levy Yulee never held public office again. His dream of a great railroad empire had exploded with the first guns of war. Yet he had set in motion a force that would truly wrench Florida from the old South, a force more powerful than any army or politician. That force was progress. Yulee had been one of the first to dream big, but not the last. His rickety railroad through the frontier was a calling card from the future. For African Americans in Florida, the war's end seemed like a beginning.
I foresaw at the beginning of the rebellion that the ordinance of secession was the death knell of slavery, and that with 4 million of freed men, the subject of equal rights could not be kept out of sight. Ocean Hart.
The popular view of Reconstruction is that a bunch of rapacious white carpetbagger former Union Army officers came down and ran the state while manipulating the votes of well-meaning but illiterate black voters. White knights, formerly in the Confederate Army, rise up as members of the Ku Klux Klan to protect Southern womanhood and rid the state of this corrupting element. The only problem with that is none of it's true.
The fact is that this is a view that comes out of Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind. But the overriding fact is this view is wrong. That if we can say anything about Reconstruction, it is a time when incredibly brave people faced unspeakable consequences trying to bring American justice to the American South.
Reconstruction almost succeeded in Florida. Hundreds of black men held public office. The black rank and file voted.
Many blacks voted because they wanted to elect blacks to represent their concerns. On a personal level, blacks felt that it was necessary to vote because free men voted. And now black males were free, and they felt that it was necessary to exert that freedom by voting and participating in the political process.
One reason they were able to vote was the chief registrar for Florida, Union loyalist Ocean Hart. Then he gained a new ally in his struggle to make Reconstruction work, a brilliant young man named Jonathan Gibbs. Gibbs was a Presbyterian minister. He'd been educated at Dartmouth and Princeton Theological Seminary.
He is about 25 years old, well-educated, and an orator by nature. Not a roarer, but a convincing, pleasant speaker. The most talented man in the Republican Party. New York Tribune.
In 1868, he was appointed as Florida's Secretary of State, the first black cabinet official in Florida. In the governor's absence, Jonathan Gibbs served as acting governor. Gibbs actively tried to punish the lawless Ku Klux Klan. For months, Florida's Secretary of State had to sleep in a fortified attic after repeated threats by the Klan. But if the Klan was his enemy, he at least had friends in high places. In 1872, Arshon Hart, 52 years old, was elected governor of Florida. Most of the state's black leaders had worked for his election. Florida seemed on the verge of an era of bright hope and good feeling.
We are not apt to trouble ourselves to look for men for office among any but our own color. But we ought to do it. And the sooner we learn to do it faithfully, the better for our country.
Arshon Hart quickly pushed through laws to protect civil rights and expand public education for both black and white.
There is so much sadness in our past. From Indian wars, slavery, Civil War, and the unavoidable acerbities of Reconstruction, Florida emerges into the present, comforting, soul-inspiring prospect, staunch, safe and free, with the old flag with all its glories as her guide.
In the early 1870s, Hart and Gibbs had unlikely company. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, came south in 1867. She bought an orange grove on the St. Johns River. Though today her book may seem cliched, in its own day, Uncle Tom's Cabin was an effective plea against slavery that moved hundreds of thousands of readers.
Lincoln is supposed to have said when he met her, "Oh, you're this little woman who wrote that book that started this war."
Harriet Beecher Stowe began writing about Florida for national journals. At times, her words sounded like a sales pitch.
It was a most heavenly morning. The blue St. John's lay in misty bands of light and shade in the distance. The birds sing in so many notes and tones the yard reverberates. And I sit and dream and am happy and never want to go back north. Harriet Beecher Stowe.
She was famous by the time she got to Florida. And the fact that she took a home in Mandarin and would write about Florida had immense significance for Florida then, for Florida now, and for the development of Florida.
For most early visitors, a trip to Florida was not about having fun. Consumption, today we call it tuberculosis, was the greatest killer in America. People with consumption believed they could cure themselves with the magic of Florida's climate.
There are now living in Florida many old, established citizens who came here 10, 20, and 30 years ago, given over in consumption, who have here for years enjoyed a happy and vigorous life. Harriet Beecher Stowe.
By the 1870s, popular writers like Mrs. Stowe had attracted a new breed of traveler who came for pleasure. But Harriet's plan to entice visitors was only a means to an end. She knew that many Floridians had been Unionists during the war.
And if they could bring in more Yankees from the North who would side with the Unionists, they could form a coalition with African Americans to outvote the traditional conservative Southerners who did not wish to see any change.
Many Northerners came. The locals called them Yankee strangers, or sometimes carpetbaggers. For Harriet Beecher Stowe and the Yankee strangers, education was the key to improving the future of the black race.
The Negro children are bright. They can be taught anything. Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Education, I think, is one of the most important achievements of the Reconstruction period. Public education put into place not only for blacks, but for whites as well. For poor whites, for the first time in many states, had the opportunity to go to public schools as a result of Reconstruction.
The Yankee strangers were already getting results. Then Governor Arshon Hart appointed a new head of education, his political ally, Jonathan Gibbs. Under Gibbs, Florida claimed the highest literacy rate in the South. For Gibbs, education was a weapon against injustice.
The horrors and tyrannies of Ku Klux organizations will be impossible when the poor classes have access to schools. Our mission is to make room for liberty. Jonathan Gibbs.
But liberty would soon become an even more distant prospect. One day in March 1874, Governor Hart stood on his veranda in Jacksonville watching a croquet game on the lawn. Hart had been ill but seemed to be recovering. On this day, he felt slightly tired and lay down. Ocean Hart would never get up again. At age 53, he was dead. A few months later, Jonathan Gibbs also went down.
Without premonition, and in the enjoyment of vigorous physical and mental powers, Mr. Gibbs was suddenly stricken down in his office about the hour of 11 o'clock. Late in the afternoon, he was removed to his residence when he breathed his last. The Tallahassee Sentinel.
Just like Hart, it was sudden and under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Fears circulated in the black community after Gibbs's death that possibly he had been poisoned as part of an effort to get Florida's leading black politicians.
Their fears grew when a Republican state senator was assassinated in 1875. The Florida Senate had been evenly split between Republicans who mostly supported Reconstruction and Democrats who opposed it. With the death of Senator Elisha Johnson, the tie was broken. The Democrats denied any role in the murder, but one of them, Henry Langle, said, "In losing Johnson, we gain a country. Who could not afford to make this sacrifice?"
With the deaths of Hart and Gibbs, the crest of hopes for Reconstruction quickly fell. Hart had been the glue that had held the promise together. With him gone from the scene, his opponents resumed control, and Reconstruction quickly died.
The political consensus for moderation evaporated, and night riders began to gallop into power. Black leaders were threatened, beaten, and killed.
And this was a means of intimidating blacks and sending a message to other blacks if they did not stay in their quote-unquote place, that these same types of tactics would be used on them.
Reconstruction was really brought to an end not by black incompetence or white Republican corruption. Reconstruction was brought to an end by terrorism.